Hiya Six, it's Miss Ahad here with your final reading lesson for this week. Today's lesson we are going to answer our big answer question together. But firstly, let's start with our vocabulary. So I'm going to just share my screen with you all. Now you know this week we have delved into this book called The Explorer by Katherine Rundell. And a lot of you have already said during our meetings that you have read this book before, which is great. No spoilers, please. So I'm going to have my turn and then you will too. So our first word is grimace. And this is a facial expression that indicates pain or disapproval. Grimace. We then have swerved, which is a verb, and this means to turn aside in movement or direction. So as you can see here, this black vehicle has swerved this white vehicle so they don't have a crash. Swerved. Next word, which is a verb, is deserted. Deserted. And that means untenanted, without inhabitants. Nobody is living here. So you could say this house here was deserted. Nobody is living there. Lurched. And this is a movement and it's to sway abruptly, and that's a verb. It's an action. Lurched. Then have infinitesimal. Infinitesimal. And this is an adjective which means tiny or extremely small. We then have another verb, and this is squinted. And this is to look with your eyes partly closed. You can see Miss Ahad is squinting here now. And you usually squint if you're having difficulty to see something. It could be closely or from afar. And lastly, we have frown, and this means to look displeased or to have an angry look. Frown. Your turn. Now we're going to go and read the text together. So I'm just going to share my screen with you all. So you should be able to see my screen here now. Flight. Like a man-made magic wish, the aeroplane began to rise. The boy sitting in the cockpit gripped his seat and held his breath as the plane climbed into the arms of the sky. Remember, the cockpit is at the front of the plane. It's usually where the pilot is controlling the aircraft. Fred's jaw was set with concentration and his fingers twitched, following the movements of the pilot beside him. Joystick, throttle. A joystick, which is also known as a control column, controls the aircraft, so almost like a manual gear stick. The aeroplane vibrated as it flew faster into the setting sun, following the swerve of the Amazon River below them. Fred could see the reflection of the six-seater plane, a spot of black on the vast sweep of blue as it spread towards Manaus, the city on the water. He brushed his hair out of his eyes and pressed his forehead against the window. Behind Fred sat a girl and her little brother. They had the same slanted eyebrows and the same brown skin, the same long eyelashes. The girl had been shy, hugging her parents until the last possible moment at the airfield. Now she was just staring down at the water, singing under her breath, her brother trying to eat his seatbelt. In the next row, on her own, sat a pale girl with blonde hair down to her waist. Her blouse had a neck ruffle that came up to her chin, and she kept tugging it down and grimacing. Well, grimacing was one of our key words from our vocabulary, and this means the look of pain or disapproval. She was determinedly not looking out of the window. The airfield they had just left had been dusty and almost deserted, uninhabited, left alone. Just a strip of tarmac under the ferocious Brazilian sun. Fred's cousin had insisted that he wear his school uniform and cricket jumper, and now, inside the hot, airless cabin, he felt like he was being gently cooked inside his own skin. The engine gave a whine. To me, this suggests that the engine is quite old, and the pilot frowned and tapped the joystick. He was old and soldiery with brisk nostril hair and a grey waxed moustache, which seemed to reject the usual laws of gravity. He touched the throttle and the plane soared upwards higher into the clouds. It was almost dark when Fred began to worry. The pilot began to belch. The verb belch means someone that's struggling to get wind up their stomach, so almost you could say someone that's burping quite a lot. First quietly, then violently and repeatedly. His hand jerked and the plane dipped suddenly to the left. Someone screamed behind Fred. The plane lurched away from the river and over the canopy. The pilot grunted, gasped and wound the throttle, slowing the engine. He gave a cough that sounded like a choke. Fred stared at the man. He was turning the same shade of grey as his moustache. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked. "Is there something I can do?" Fighting for breath, the pilot shook his head. He reached over to the control panel and cut the engine. The roar ceased, which means to discontinue or stop. The nose of the plane dipped downwards. The trees rose up. "What's happening?" asked the blonde girl sharply. "What's he doing? Make him stop." The little boy in the back began to shriek. This suggested to me the little boy felt quite scared. He was like shrieking, cuddling up. The pilot grasped Fred's wrist hard for a single moment. Then his head slumped against the dashboard. And the sky, which had seconds before seemed so reliable, gave way. The green dark. The adjectives here may be suggesting to me, have they landed in the Amazon? Let's find out. Fred wondered as he ran if he was dead, but he thought death would surely be quieter. The roar of the flames and his own blood vibrated through his hands and feet. The night was black. He tried to heave in breath to shout for help as he ran, but his throat was too dry and ashy to yell. He jabbed his finger into the back of his tongue to summon up spit. Jabbed, which means to poke his finger into the back of his tongue. "Is anybody there? Help! Fire!" he shouted. The fire called back in response. A tree behind him set up a fountain of flames. There was a rumble of thunder. Nothing else replied. A burning branch cracked, spat red, and fell in a cascade of sparks. Fred leapt away, stumbling backwards into the dark and smacking his head against something hard. The branch landed exactly where he'd been standing seconds before. He swallowed the bile that rose in his throat and began to run again, faster and wilder. Something landed on his chin and he ducked, smacking at his face, but it was only a raindrop. The rain came suddenly and hard. It turned the soot and sweat on his hands into to something like tar, but it began to quench the fire. Fred slowed his run to a jog, then to a stop, gasping, choking. He looked back the way he had come. The little aeroplane was in trees. Oh, has the aeroplane crashed here? That's what the language is suggesting to me. It was smoking, sending up clouds of white and grey into the night sky. He stared around, dizzy and desperate, but he couldn't see or hear a single human, only the fern-like plants growing around his ankles and the trees reaching hundreds of feet up into the sky and the panic dive and shriek of birds. He shook his head, trying to banish the shipwreck roar in his ears. The hair on his arm was singed. This means it was burnt and smelt of eggs. He put his hand to his forehead. His eyebrows had charred again, suggesting that something had been burnt, and part of it came away on his fingers. He wiped his eyebrow on the sleeve of his shirt. Fred looked down at himself. One leg of his trousers was ripped all the way up to the pocket, but none of his bones felt broken. There was a vicious pain, though, in his back and neck, and it made his arms and legs feel far off and foreign. A voice came suddenly from the dark. "Who's there? Get away from us!" Fred spun round, his ears still buzzing. He grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it in the direction of the voice. He ducked behind a tree and crouched on his haunches, poised to jump or run. Poised to jump or run means that his body positioning was ready to jump or stop running. His head sounded like his heart sounded like a one-man band. He tried not to exhale, which means he tried not to breathe to make any noise he didn't want to be caught. A voice said, "For God's sakes, don't throw things." Now, we've read through the text together. What we're going to do now is answer the big question. So please pause the video, have the text in front of you and the question ready to answer together. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. So we're going to answer our big question together. The big question asks me to look at page 3, so I know my evidence will be found on page 3. The question is, how does the author show that the pilot is not fit to fly the plane? And it's a 3-mark question. Well, firstly, I need to understand the question. Well, I know to not be fit to fly, it means you may have a health condition which doesn't allow you to fly. It makes it difficult for you to fly. And this question is 3 marks. Well, I know for a 3-mark question, I must have a point, a piece of evidence, another point, and another piece of evidence. Both points must be different, and also both pieces of evidence must be different. So let's go on and have a look for our evidence. So I'm going to turn to page 3. I'd like you to also turn to page 3. Here's page 3 under my visualizer, and we're going to have a read together. The engine gave a whine, and the pilot frowned and tapped the joystick. He was old and soldiery, with brisk nostril hair and a grey wax moustache, which seemed to reject the usual laws of gravity. Already, to me, the language here suggesting to me the pilot's quite old. He touched the throttle, and the plane soared upwards, higher into the clouds. It was almost dark when Fred began to worry. The pilot began to belch, first quietly, then violently and repeatedly. To belch means it's almost like burping when someone has quite a lot of wind in their stomach. His hand jerked and the plane dipped suddenly to the left. Someone screamed behind Fred. The plane lurched away from the river and over the canopy. The pilot granted, gasped, and wound back the throttle, slowing the engine. He gave a cough that sounded like a choke, again to me suggesting that he's struggling for breath. Fred stared at the man. He was turning the same shade of grey as his moustache. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked. "Is there something I can do?" Fighting for breath, again suggesting to me he's finding it difficult to fly the plane. The pilot shook his head. Well, actually, this suggests to me maybe he's determined here. He reached over the control panel and cut the engine. The roar ceased, which means to stop or discontinue. The nose of the plane dipped downwards. The trees rose up. Well, firstly, I'm just going to underline he was old and soldiery, because that suggests to me that maybe his age might make him unfit to fly. Then I remember language that was used, belched. The pilot began to belch, first quietly, then violently and repeatedly. I'm going to draw my point off here. And I remember my question asked me, how does the author show that the pilot is not fit to fly? Here, suggesting to me he's burping constantly, making him unaware of what he is doing. So I'm going to say unfit to fly, because he may lose control because he's burping first quietly, violently, and then repeatedly. The action of it being repeated means that it's more than once. The pilot granted, gasped, and wound back the throttle, slowing the engine. He gave a cough that sounded like a choke. Again, to me, this suggesting to me that he's struggling here. Looking back at my question, does that link in with the pilot is not fit to fly? Yes, because he's coughing it and he may be actually choking, which suggests that he's unfit to fly. Fred stared at the man. He was turning the same shade of grey as his moustache. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked. "Is there something I can do?" Fighting for breath, the pilot shook his head. Well, I definitely know this will be a piece of evidence that I can use, that the pilot is not fit to fly. However, he's adamant. He shook his head, suggesting he's determined he wants to fly this plane. So I'm going to say, feeling unwell, but determined. Now, I'm going to go to my question and I'll start to write this up. Remember, I need to make sure I put a point, evidence, another point, and another piece of evidence. Well, I'm firstly going to start with the question. The question asks me, how does the author show that the pilot is not fit to fly a plane? Remember, a pilot is the person who is qualified to fly a plane. Okay, so I'm going to start my sentence, capital letter, the pilot, and I'm going to say is not fit to fly. And then I'm going to finish off and say he's not fit to fly the plane as well. I know from the language, I'm going to go with this piece of evidence here. The language used, the verb belch, suggests to me that he is struggling to, stay up because he is burping constantly, quite violently and viciously. So I'm going to say the pilot is not fit to fly the plane as the verb. I'm going to put in speech marks was from the text. Belt suggests that he was having, instead of saying burping, I'm going to actually extend my sentence and say having a lot of wind come up from his stomach, making it difficult for him to control the plane. Now, I've given my point. I need to give my piece of evidence. Well, I know the piece of evidence will come from the pilot began to belch, first quietly, then violently and repeatedly. So I'm going to put that piece of evidence in. I'm going to say the evidence states and I'm going to copy that in. The evidence states, again, speech marks is coming from the text. The pilot began to belch first quietly, then violently, suggesting to me it's getting worse here now. And then repeatedly, again, more than once. And ending off my quote with my speech mark again, ending that off. Now, I'm going to read that back to myself. The pilot is not fit to fly the plane as the verb belch suggests. Forgot. That he was having a lot of wind come up from his stomach, making it difficult for him to control the plane. The evidence states the pilot began to belch, first quietly, then violently and repeatedly. Now I'm going to add an adverbial here. Additionally, and I'm going to write additionally, I'm going to go with this piece of evidence here. Fighting for breath, the pilot shook his head. This suggests to me he's fighting for his breath. He's struggling to breathe here, but he's adamant that he's going to get it. And he's shaking his head because he wants to control this plane. So I'm going to say, additionally, the pilot was also struggling for breath. Additionally, the pilot is also struggling for breath, but he was determined to take control of the plane. But he was determined to take control of the plane. So now I've written my point, my second point, and I'm going to put in my piece of evidence. Well, I've got my piece of evidence. It's fighting for breath. The pilot shook his head. So I'm going to write my evidence in. So fighting for breath. Pilot shook his head. Full stop. And I need to make sure I end off my quotation. So I'm going to read that out to you again and see if Miss Add has scored all 3 marks. The question asks us, how does the author show that the pilot is not fit to fly the plane? It's 3 marks. Remember, we need to look at page 3 and that is where our evidence is. Firstly, I'm going to start off. The pilot is not fit to fly the plane as the verb belch suggests that he was having a lot of wind come up from his stomach, making it difficult for him to control the plane. The evidence states the pilot began to belch, first quietly, then violently and repeatedly. Additionally, the pilot was also struggling for breath, but he was determined to take control of the plane. Fighting for breath, the pilot shook his head. Now, what I'd like you to do, Year 6, is to have a look at other pieces of evidence that could help you answer this question. I cannot wait to see your responses on Seesaw. Happy writing. I'll see you on Monday. Bye.